All right, guys, thank you so much for coming out and for your patience. So we're going to be kind of doing two different aspects, kind of the yin and yang to 360 video production today. I'll be covering some more of the technical aspects, and I'll be covering some more of the storytelling aspects, and hopefully you guys can walk away with some insights of what the entire post-production, or really just the entire 360 pipeline looks like, and how different pieces come together. So just a little bit about me. I'm a creative technologist and VR producer. I run a small indie studio based in Financial District and in Chandigarh, India. I come from a background of enterprise AR and VR stuff, so Google Glass, Epson, Moverio, that type of stuff. And then prior to that, product design. My social media links, if anyone would like to follow. But before we get started, I'd love to just kind of gauge this audience here. How many of you guys are actually capturing 360 content? Like Theta and Gear 360 included. Okay, that's awesome. Any 360 videographers? So you're using like a multi-camera array, at least 4+ cameras, okay. Great. Any post-production folks who are actually adding 3D VFX and stuff like that to 360? Yeah. Awesome. And any agency folks out here, creative talent? And then game engine guys or gals? Okay, there we go. Wonderful. And any others?
Screenwriters.
Screenwriter? Cool.
Marketing. I'm a learner.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so starting off in 360 VR is somewhat overwhelming, and these are just terms that kind of first came to me is like, what rig do we use, how many cameras, blah, 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 IPD, zenith, natter, like projection mapping, structured light, all this stuff that you kind of have to absorb. It can be overwhelming, but fret not. 360 video, in my opinion, is just old wine in a new bottle, right? And panoramas aren't new. They've been around since QuickTime VR dropped in '95, and the content creation suite came out in '97. And games like Myst and certainly real estate agents have been putting panoramas to good use for a while, right? Now, what is new though is that, I'm not going to give you guys the, accelerated growth of technology spiel, but it's basically, the cell phone has made it so that VR can be consumed now. We can consume 360 VR panoramas in 4K, in 30 or 60 FPS, and do it at scale, right? That's the big difference now. So it's becoming somewhat mainstream if you consider what's happening now to be mainstream. So one of the fundamental terms that you need to know in 360 VR is a 360 by 180 panorama. And what is that, right? So in simple terms, it's just a two-dimensional representation, a flat two-dimensional representation of what a 3D space looks like from one singular point, right? So imagine if you shrunk down to an infinitesimally small size with an equally small camera and perfectly rotated around 360 degrees horizontally and 180 degrees vertically, you'd basically end up with a 360 by 180, 2x1 lat-long equirectangular image. And we'll dive into equirectangular a little bit down the line. Now, how is capturing 360 stills different than 360 video stuff that we're doing right now? So the old way that you probably are familiar with is, you take a DSLR, slap on a reasonably wide lens, put it on a nodal panoramic head, like a nodal ninja as pictured in this diagram, and just take a couple pictures and stitch it together, right? Now, can you do that with 360 video? And the answer is yes. We'll explore why, but there are other situations where you kind of want to capture the action in all directions at all times, right? So for that, people kind of digress into what is funnily called the BBOC approach. It's just a big ball of cameras, right? No matter what kind of camera you slap in there, usually the design tends to be pretty much the same, right? So coming back to making 360 with one camera, I think for people here who have, say, a nice DSLR already, I think the cheapest way you can get started in 360 is by investing in a decent Samyang or Rokinon fisheye. They're very cheap, like $200-300. So cheaper than the cost of a gear, you can make really high quality 4K, 6K mono 360 content. And as pictured over here, some of the older Felix and Paul stuff, as well as some of the stuff that Stress Level 0 does, is all usually done with two pro-grade cameras, usually a Red Dragon or an A7S side by side, and just shoot everything piecewise. So in this diagram, you can kind of see the various different segments of action in that full 360 by 180 panel have been kind of filmed individually and then comped in post, right? So stitching is something that I was told to just skim over because it's been covered apparently in previous talks. So really, it's very, very similar between photographs and videos. Stitching that stuff together, basically you're taking the individual camera feeds and you're going to output the 2x1 lat long equirectangular that we were just discussing. Now, how it usually works is you have something called a base stitch or a reference template stitch of one frame of your video sequence that'll serve as a basis for whatever software you use to kind of go through the rest of the frames. We're also seeing advances in, thanks to advances in computer vision and machine learning, we're seeing kind of optical flow-based algorithmic stitching approaches becoming viable. But these aren't without their limitations, as we'll discuss. So, this is a pretty simple diagram. You guys have probably seen this type of video. Just, take all your SD cards, all the individual frames. Now, whether you do it in something like Nuke or do it something on Nuke or in PT GUI or on your phone, really the concept is the same, and that's all you really need to know. So what are the tools of the trade when it comes to stitching? Very quickly, kind of the legacy stuff is PT GUI and AutoPano Giga. So this was for stills. And then built on top of AutoPano Giga is AutoPano Video Pro. So this is where, kind of AutoPano Giga in the background is doing all the stitching, but AutoPano Video Pro is built on top of that and gives you some more flexible video-centric options like the ability to choose multiple templates for a video sequence. So just as an example, if you're kind of walking through a hallway and then walking to a much wider and open space, you might have one stitch template that's for the walk down the hallway, and you might have another reference stitch template that is for the new space that you've gone into, right? Because you kind of need to recalibrate stuff when the environment changes drastically. Video Stitch is another very similar option, and the Foundry folks have Nuke and Kara VR, which is a significantly pricier but pro-grade compositing solution. And then you have everyone under the sun, Google, Facebook, Nokia, GoPro, Pixvana, one of the sponsors of this event, all have their cloud-based stitching approach, but also client-side. So if you have something like the Ozo, you could have a reasonably powerful Mac Pro, and you can do that stitching, locally on your client machine. Granted, it will take a really long time, right? So what are the caveats here? There's no one perfect, kind of approach for stitching. And it really just depends on, are you stitching mono or stereo stuff, which we'll dive into in a little bit, what kind of rig design, how quickly do you need it? Like cloud stitching really takes a long, long time. Like people don't understand. They think, oh, you can just scale to X number of servers. No, optical flow is a very, very computationally intensive process of stitching stuff. So usually production clients will use a combination of all of these approaches based on the timeline that they have. So jumping onto the cliche chevron diagram over here, in very rudimentary terms, it kind of ties in very similarly to the kind of production pipeline you guys are all used to. In the pre-production phase, based on like the concept, like why are we doing this in 360? Are we doing this in parallel to say like another traditional rectilinear shoot, and we need to get in and go do something in 360 quickly? Are we live streaming stuff? Do we need spatial audio? All these kind of considerations come very early on in the phase, and based on that, you kind of come up with your VR stack, right, for the whole production. Production is when you go out and shoot the stuff. This is probably the easiest part of 360 videography, as most of the guys who are doing it are familiar with. You go out there, you shoot your stuff. Hopefully you're utilizing some kind of live monitoring solution so you know what's in the can is actually good to go. I've seen people do something as simple as taking a Gear 360 like that over there and putting it on top of like the jump rig or whatever, so you can kind of at least have some idea of how things will turn out. Now, the only different thing to point out here is, and this applies both to computational stitching as well as like manual stitching approaches, is you have something called a dailies quality stitch that you'll usually get. Whether you use a cloud stitching solution or whatever, you'll do kind of a rough stitch without too much effort at, let's say, half res, and you start editorial based on that, right? And once you've made your editorial decisions about, okay, these are the exact segments of the shots that I need, then you go back and either plug it into your cloud stitching solution or to your poor godforsaken stitchers and say that, hey, I want you now to give me a fine stitch of the selected footage, right? And finally, you have optimization and delivery, which is pretty straightforward, right? We're all familiar with that. So 360 video is hot, but please, one thing I love saying in any of these talks is there's no magic bullet. There are a lot of people who will try to sell you on their rig as the perfect one-size-fits-all solution. That is just not the case. Like, I'd like to see somebody stick I don't know, an Ozo or a Jump inside of a car. You just can't do it, right? Like, so it depends. And certainly on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, you'll see ridiculous things like people saying 360 by 360, it'll be gen locked, global shutter, all this stuff, and then the camera never comes out. And this has happened several times, and I personally bit the bullet on 2 such cameras. So if you guys are thinking about buying a Kickstarter camera, don't do it, man. Don't do it. And yeah, so, and why is there no magic bullet? Because there's so many ways to create 360 content, right? Like, we've been talking about live action stuff, but just as well, the game engine guys would agree, you could build a really nice environment in Unreal or Unity and bake that out as a stereo 360 video. You could do, the traditional CGI approach and use like deferred rendering like Max Maya and slap it through Arnold, or maybe start doing with some of the hybridized rendering approaches that are kind of blending, the lines between, deferred Arnold style rendering and real-time game engines. So example of this would be like Otoy's Octane Render or iRay and Redshift. These utilize GPU compute capability to render out stuff way faster. So just like film, there's no one lens or camera combination that'll do it all. And I think one more thing that people don't really think about that much is, what is the final delivery format, right? Like, if this video is going on Facebook 360, why would you shoot this on a 4 times Dragon rig? It just doesn't make sense. Similarly, if you're trying to put something inside of, Samsung VR, like a Gear VR headset, you probably don't want to shoot it on a Theta, or maybe not even the Gear 360, right? So those are some things you have to consider. Very quickly jumping into kind of considerations for rig design. I think the big difference, or kind of the commonality that you might notice, is people try to use as small cameras as possible, right? And for obvious reasons, that is to kind of reduce the minimum distance between each of those lenses, right? So smaller pro-grade cameras like, Blackmagic Studios, or, action cams like Xiaomi Yis or GoPros, and even security cameras. Point Grey Research makes a wide range of very high quality, security cameras that output RAW, like 10-bit RAW, and are an excellent choice. Some of the other considerations include, do you want to shoot in stereo or mono? That's like, obviously your rig design will completely change. And usually how people do it is they'll add just pairs, stereo pairs. So you have a bunch of stereo pairs, in a concentric ring or some kind of polygonal configuration. But what we're also seeing now is being able to extract stereo from wider fisheye lenses. So if you can imagine like 4 GoPros with a 220-degree lens on it, there's so much overlap between each adjacent lens that you can literally split each lens down the middle and extract the left and right eye, right? And still have fairly decent, it tends to be more hyper stereo, meaning that everyone looks a little bit shrunk down, but it's far, far easier to do than, maybe it gives you a lot more possibilities than having a bunch of cameras in a stereo pair configuration. Resolution is huge. Gen locking is something that I definitely felt is important to know as a term and really what gen lock means is that there's one master clock signal that is triggering each of those cameras, right? As you can imagine, if you've got 10 cameras pointed in different directions and the camera's like rapidly moving around, even a few frames of disparity between each of those feeds can make it look like the whole image is out of whack. And how people reduce that is if you have a rolling shutter camera, which is pretty much most cameras on the market, you try to shoot at a higher frame rate so you can get close to about 2 to 3 frames in sync. The ideal situation is to have a global shutter camera, and so you can actually gen lock everything. So not just the white balance, exposure, shutter speed, all that good stuff, but like a pixel or line level sync between each of the cameras, right? A big consideration with 360 rigs certainly is the minimum stitchable distance, and you'll see people talk about this a lot. And all that really means is how close can I get to the rig without having stitchers have a complete nightmare trying to put this together. So if you have experiences where you want actors and actresses to be pretty close to the camera, those are things you need to account for. How it's traditionally done is you use a 3 or 4 camera rig. with at least a 180-degree lens on it, if not more. Then movement requirements. You don't want something like a jaunt rig be handed to some reporter who's going to South Africa, right? So depending on the lighting, weather, proximity, all those type of considerations, your rig design will change. I'm going to just skip through this slide here. Now, we talked about mono and stereo, right? Now, what are some of the issues with stereo 360? Have any of you guys, do you guys know the difference between mono and stereo 360 by a show of hands? Okay, cool. So real quick, for stereo, basically it means is how 360 rendering, how all this stuff works is, this is how a 360 player works, right? Like you've got that lat long image that we're talking about, and you're projecting it on some kind of 3D geometry. Now imagine you do this twice for each of your eyes, right? That's basically what stereo means. So you'll get a lot more depth, and it won't look like, let's say a person is a 20-foot tall projection on a wall. You can actually discern some of that stuff. And stereo is one of the ways in which the human eyes sense depth. It's not the only cue that the eyes use, but it's one of them. Now the problem with live action stereo capture is usually it means a bigger rig. So if you look at the jump rig that Google has, much more massive, right? So that means how portable is it going to be? Are you going to be able to take this everywhere with you? Setting up, battery, all those considerations create a problem. And certainly what it also does is increases the parallax between each of those pairs and lenses. And it also increases the minimum distance. So you lose a lot suddenly, and people start wondering, is it worth doing stereo? It is. You just need to figure out for your exact need. Like once you have the concept down, you can figure out what the best way to do that. And maybe the best way is to have like a side-by-side Sony rig or a Red rig to capture that versus using something like an Ozo. Another problem that you tend to have is, if you think about it, how stereo works is you've got the left and the right eye, right? Like now just imagine I'm like making the stereo rig over here. The left, right eye, left, right eye, left, right eye, left, right eye, and I've got images coming from them. As I'm like turning left and right, okay, I'm transitioning from pair to pair and it's fine, but what happens when you look straight up? And what happens if you look straight up and start rotating? If you rotate completely around, suddenly you've got, cross-eye effect. The left and the right eye is completely different. So usually what people will do is they'll taper off the stereo as you go to the poles, to the zenith and the nadir, and most people don't even notice it, right? And lastly, this is a problem that's probably going to go away very quickly, which is that you've got this 2x1 video MPEG file that you usually upload to a bunch of these formats. You can't do a square upload, like a 4K by 4K. So what you end up having to do is take the left and right eye and squeeze it into one image. So this is actually supposed to be a full 2x1 lat long. So you're effectively losing half of your resolution, right? So those are trade-offs that people have to consider whether or not to do this in stereo. Now, the cool thing here though is that you can still do great stereo using CGI, because we don't need to worry about these cameras being bigger or smaller. We can put as many cameras as we need at one singular point and do something called a perfect slit scan render. So basically, this is an awesome research paper by Dr. Burke. You can look this up. And essentially, what we're doing here is we're scanning down this whole 360 by 180 panorama, and for each line, each degree, we're coming up with a left and right pixel view, vertical pixel view. And when you put that all together, you get a perfect stereo render. That's basically what the jump stitcher is also trying to do. It's trying to create those intermediate views between each of those lenses, and then just taking a pixel per degree and slapping that all together. And I do love to say this. If it sounded like too much, don't even worry about it. If you use like V-Ray or Octane or whatever, you literally just choose spherical camera and boom, you're in business. You can start rendering out stereo stuff and 360 stuff. Okay, so we got our 360 footage. It could be live action, it could be CG. Now, how do we add stuff to it, right? Like that's the main question. I want to add some lightsabers, some explosions, some sparks, maybe some titles. So really how it works is converting between projection types. So we talked about this lat-long projection, right? Like unwrapping the world map, right? Now, as you can see, there's a lot of distortion as you go towards the poles, right? That's why the Arctic and Antarctic circles look massive compared to everything else that's more centered in the lat-long projection. So obviously it's not conducive for you to be able to add titles here directly because they won't distort properly when they're rewrapped, right? So the key or the trick that most people use is a box map projection, and any game folks in the house would be very familiar with cube maps and skyboxes and box maps, right? The advantage of this approach is we're basically unwrapping the world again, but instead of unwrapping it into a 2x1 sheet of paper, we're unwrapping it as a box, right? So when you do that, you have 90, 90, 90, 90 degrees, so you got the 360 there, you got the 180 there, and each of these square pieces of footage are now just like any rectilinear 2D footage that you've dealt with, yes?
What's the downside of doing a box map?
Yes.
This other one?
So the downside, and I'll come into this in the next slide, the downside is that if you're going to be adding effects to this, you need to make sure that whatever add-ons you're making fit perfectly in one of these boxes, right? Because there's still going to be distortion at the seam edges of each of those boxes. So what people will usually do is you can reorient the sphere. So let's say you're trying to patch you're trying to patch out some actor, and the actor was actually kind of between those two seams. You can reorient the sphere and move them over here, and then just reverse that transform in comp, and that'll make a little bit more sense when I go to the next diagram. So you start off with your lat long plate, you convert it into a box map, but what you can also do is convert it into a camera, a rectilinear camera of an arbitrary field of view. So, going back to the issue that we have is like maybe a 90-degree field of view is not enough for you to, add that dinosaur or whatever you're seeking to add. So in that situation, what you can do is in applications like Nuke or Fusion, not in After Effects, mind you, you can say I need a 120-degree camera, and you don't even care about the rest of the box. So you kind of like cut out this piece of the sphere and unwrap that as a rectilinear footage, add whatever you need, and then you reverse that transform again. You go back to lat long. Now, the only caveat here is this conversion process is a lossy process, obviously. So when you're converting back to lat long, it's very important that you only convert back the new stuff that you're slapping on top, if that makes sense. So if I'm like just patching the tripod, only the tripod patched, unwrapped, with an alpha channel is what you'll slap on the footage in the end. And that's basically how this works. Hopefully that made sense.
Do you have this graphic somewhere? Or?
I just made it.
No,
Yeah.
This is great. I like it.
Cool, thank you. So basically by converting between a few different projection types, you can do all that you usually do in post, grade it, add titles, motion track stuff, all that good stuff, right? It's pretty straightforward. And you got some beautiful plugins out there on the market now that make this very, very easy to do. So Dashwood Studios has a very similar suite to Metal. They're Mac only. Metal has a cross-platform Mac and PC suite for After Effects. And then you've got the much more expensive but much more extensive Kara VR suite by the Foundry folks. And so these guys make it even easier so that, like, let's say you're feeling lazy and you want to add a title, down at the bottom of the lat long directly, you can do that and it'll automatically account for the distortion as you're going towards the zenith and the nadir. So, in the end, the boring stuff, you got your master file. Usually people will do like a 4K, 6K, or 12K Cineform. You compress that down to different stuff for the Gear VR, YouTube, Samsung VR. The saving grace for all content creators right now is finally H.265 and the new Snapdragon processors. You can actually decode 4K by 4K square footage, which means stereo will probably look a lot better and will start getting more popular. Yeah.
So I found that you can, with at least with Gear and YouTube, you can upload like 8K stuff onto there. And Gear takes that, and I know the Galaxy S7 can actually play 4000 by 4000.
Yeah.
And it hits the limit right around 4050 or something.
Gotcha. That's good to know. That's good to know. Yeah, I've definitely seen people upload 6K 360 videos to YouTube. Now that you mention it.
I was uploading 4000 by 4000 and calling it 4K.
Yeah. Close enough, right? And one more thing I will, handy tip for YouTube is, and they kind of recommend this too, is especially if you're using Adobe Media Encoder to do your final MPEG compression, first off, don't just get X264 or some professional grade encoding software, or up the bit rate to at least 100 Mbit, because YouTube's going to compress the crap out of it anyway. Might as well try to give it the highest quality you can send up. So I think closing this all off, how does 360 video playback and streaming work, right? You're basically reprojecting that 2x1 lat long that we've been talking about, the 360 by 180 panorama. You can jump in and look around at a certain view. 360 streaming works in a very similar fashion, but they actually also enjoy using a cube map or sometimes even a pyramid or some really random geometry. The advantage there is they kind of compress each of the faces of the cube as individual video clips that, and compress them in all varying quality types. So whatever the head vector is looking at gets, or whatever you're looking at is decoded in full res, and you can kind of gracefully degrade the rest and only really, stream it in full res when you're looking at something. And this is another great thing because you can have older phones that can't even decode 2K footage, like an iPhone 5S or whatever. You could still play back and at least max out the screen resolution and get really good quality on that. Now, some of the more fun stuff that I just wanted to talk about, and he's got a great demo that you guys should check out. Could you tell me your name again? Chris. Yeah, Chris has an excellent demo that kind of showcases this. There are two approaches in 360. One is like guiding the gaze of the viewer, where you kind of guess where they might be looking based on audio samples that you might have put, different things like that, or lighting conditions. But what we're going to start seeing more and more is this kind of pseudo-interactive approach, which has a lot of benefits. So if you guys have been producing 360 content, one of the biggest problems that happens is you've got the user in one shot looking in one direction, which is not the main subject of interest. So when they transition to the next shot, they're completely not looking at the right direction. If you do a pseudo-interactive approach, you know the head vector of the user, and you can always reorient the scene since you know the subject of interest in each consecutive cut that you make. It just makes for a much more streamlined experience. And certainly this will also kind of enable more branching narratives or perhaps parallel narratives and things like that. So what's on the horizon? Just thinking forward, I think pseudo-interactive 360 stuff is going to be huge. Unity just announced 4K support natively, so you don't need a plugin or whatever to start making awesome 360 experiences in Unity. You're certainly seeing a lot of sensor fusion stuff, so you guys might have seen some of the more higher-end Hollywood-esque rigs where they'll slap like a LiDAR sensor or a structured light sensor on top, and they'll use that information as a part of the stitching process to fix some of the parallax issues or use that information to generate the left and right eye image, if that makes sense. Because you kind of have the depth information, you can use that to extrapolate and generate a disparity, the left and right eye disparity. Photogrammetric video is going to be huge. Maybe you guys are familiar with traditional photogrammetry. Sheridan? Is that your name, Sheridan? Yeah, Sheridan was talking about how they use drones to survey large areas in a very similar fashion. Instead of surveying large areas, what if we have a bunch of cameras facing inwards and then we put an actor inside of there, and basically using the same photogrammetric.
It's a weird construct to work in. So if you're shooting 360 video, I call it they call it the Swayze effect in the movie Ghost, because you're just kind of sitting there. So if you're shooting 360 video, the first question to ask is, does this belong in 360? And there's a number of different ways to take advantage of this format, but rigorously asking yourself, why am I shooting this in 360 and does this belong in 360? So there's a few different ways that I've seen to use the space. One is experience surrounding you. So for example, you're in the middle of a protest. There's things happening everywhere. You can choose where to look. There's very little narrative guiding. You're in the ocean. There's a whale over here, and there's some fish over here. So if you create an extremely immersive experience. Another way is front back. And this is the way I prefer to use because it's a little less 360. It's basically you use the space in front of the viewer for the main action, and then there's observers standing behind. So if you're at a stand-up comedy show, for example, you can capture the entire stage, and then you can see the audience behind you. If there's some dancers dancing on a sidewalk, you can capture all the people who are watching the dancers, which is really cool because it shows it allows the viewer to identify with other people that are viewing the content. Another option is 180. 180 is, I think, a really interesting and compelling format. 180 allows you to shoot with a single lens. It allows you to use lighting. And it also gives a lot of the immersion that 360 creates. You can even go to 220, 240, and you still have a director, a camera, and different lighting elements. And the viewer is completely removed from the requirement to look behind them. So there's a number of different ways. I'll talk a little bit about modalities. So you have the film modality, which is what a lot of people have tried to shoehorn into the 360 films. What? Oh, film modality. So what are elements of a film modality? What are some tropes that you would use when creating narrative film? So one example would be close-ups versus wide shots. So you might go from a really wide shot to a close-up. So you've both used a close-up and a wide shot and an edit between them. So if you show someone on their knees screaming and there's a close-up of their face, and then you're a mile away from them and you realize how giant their environment is, and you're bringing into this notions of man versus the environment. These are things that are a little bit harder to do in 360. You can make a cut, but it's a little more jarring. A close-up isn't going to be a close-up on everything unless you're in a very tiny room. So that's one technique. Framing is another technique. So whether things enter or leave frame, there's a lot of visual jokes that work well in two-dimensional film that just don't translate to 360 film. So you'll see a lot of people moving away from a film modality. There's the video game modality. And a video game is the things that define a video game is you can move through a video game. The narrative component is very, very small. So there are people who will argue that there's narrative video games. I personally don't play a lot of video games, but what my friends who do play video games tell me, and what I've seen when I notice video games, is a lot of what's providing your experience is your environment and the different types of action and movement that you can do. Whereas in a narrative, like in a movie, a lot of what's providing your experience is where the action hits at different points. It's it's basically, a video game is like you're holding a violin and messing around with it, and a movie is like you're sitting and you're listening to someone play. Both are really fun, but they're in some ways really different things. The modality that I'm most excited about is theater. And theater is very similar to virtual reality for a lot of different reasons. One reason is that the director is not as in charge as they are normally. A director in theater will stage a production, determine blocking, and then they get out of the way. And it's really the viewer and the people who are acting in a theatrical production. The other is that theater uses space in an entirely different way. Theater has a rich history of cues and tropes designed to get you to pay attention to something. For example, a light comes up somewhere, or someone walks on stage and they're alone, and then they start speaking. Someone walks in after that, they might be really far away, which implies different types of distance. So the way that theatrical directors use space, and if you've ever seen theatrical production, a lot of those tropes can be taken and used. How about immersive theater? Have any of you been in immersive theater?
What is that?
Sleep No More is an example. Then She Fell. What's that?
Cirque du Soleil would be.
Cirque du Soleil. Okay, I haven't seen that, but
Well, I mean,
it sounds
they're all over you, right?
right. Yeah. I'm not sure if.
You ever made it good theater?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Cirque du Soleil, because the thing with immersive theater is that you are treated as if you are a character. You are treated as if you are within that environment. So there's immersive theater that is much more improv. Like there's I think Moops. There's these giant. I heard about a Harry Potter one in a castle where thousands of people go to the castle and pretend to be Harry Potter characters, and they'll just get into character and they'll go and talk to each other for days. There's ones where you're that participatory, but there's a lot of ones where you're not really participatory at all. So I saw Then She Fell in New York, and it's an Alice in Wonderland story. And they have 16 people. The people come in, and they take you through different scenes. So they take you into a room, lie you down on a bed, and say, "Listen, let me tell you a story." And it's still a bit of a nascent genre. It's been popular for several decades, but it's starting to become a lot more popular. So if you're ever in New York, the stuff that Third Rail Productions does and Sleep No More are good examples to get you starting to think. But the point with immersive theater is that you're treating the viewer like they're a person. And imagine that, because You can place the camera in the middle of action, and that's one way to do it. But you can also place the camera and imagine that they're a person, and they're an audience member. And I think we often have very strict notions of what the fourth wall is and isn't. And I would say just throw out those notions when you're dealing with 360 and start playing. A lot of these tropes have still not been very well defined. So yeah, I'll talk about directing for VR and some strategies. So one is put your head in the space of a viewer. This might be your viewer's first VR video. It might be their second VR video, but you want someone whose first VR video it is to be able to use your video. So give them a little bit of time and space when they put it on. Perhaps you can have some audio that's important about 20, 30 seconds in, but you want to have some filler stuff that's interesting. You also want to cue them to the fact that they can look around and that they should be looking around. And you want to cue them to the ways in which you want them to be looking around. For example, if there's important action happening at all points of your video, early on do that. So in Oculus Story Studio video, they started off and they had a butterfly, and the butterfly came towards you and then it moved off to the side. And this was a really innovative way to say, hey, you should look around. And they gave a lot of time, so I think at least 30 seconds before anything really major or important happens is really important. Cues to move attention. People are still coming up with these. There's no correct answer with this. One really exciting development is now ambisonic audio, spatial audio, which allows you to place audio at different points in the 360 sphere, is being supported on YouTube and on Samsung VR. So you can create an ambisonic audio mix, which there are two guys who are here who have a company that could do that for you. But it ties the spatial location to the video. That can be really helpful, but you also don't want to rely on that because someone might be using it on a different device. Other cues that are helpful, I've seen arrows pointing different directions, people looking. I'll show you a little bit about this of this film that I made where we're using lights coming up and down to cue people. But think really carefully about the cues. Something that can happen is if there's too many things to look at or the viewer starts, so you want to try and decrease FOMO in the viewer, fear of missing out.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and so if the viewer starts to miss things, then anxiety will come up. And so you either want to clearly communicate at the beginning of the video that it doesn't matter where they look. For example, if they're in a giant crowd scene and everything around them is interesting, they'll probably stop worrying about where to look. Whereas I was watching a video where there was an action and you'd be looking over here and there'd be action and then it would cut and the action would move to over here. And it would take me about 5 seconds to find it. So that creates a tremendous anxiety where you're starting to worry that you're going to miss something. Also creating storylines that it doesn't matter if you miss something. Storylines where a lot of it, some of the most effective uses of 360 I've seen are documentaries where you're looking at an experience and you're hearing narration. And now you know you can't miss anything because your job is to just sit, take it in, and listen to your narrator. So ways that you can help the viewer, at the same time, if you can provide different things in the background so the viewer gets a treat if they watch it again. Yeah, filling the frame with density of action. So you want to think about how much action is happening in each part of the frame. If you are trying to fill the entire 360 frame, put something here, put something there, put something there, so that people can look around. You can also, as I was saying previously, have all the action happening here and have the camera up against a wall. I think that's a completely valid way to do 360 video. I'm excited to see more uses of the bottom of the frame. I think there's a lot of opportunity for putting information at the bottom or having people look down to see information, which I haven't seen too much of. Usually people will put their logos down there. I personally don't like logos down there because it's if you don't want your viewer to feel weird, like there's nothing more weird than staring down and seeing somebody's logo.
On that point, I'd love to ask you, what are your thoughts on patching? Like the Felix and Paul guys do like a full black patch. They don't put anything there versus removing the rig and having the ground be there, like, and kind of creating the Swayze effect. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, personally, it doesn't bother me. I don't mind being 6 feet from the ground and not seeing anything. I think that I would say go with your gut and there's a lot of wisdom about what works and what doesn't work in VR. For example, that you're not supposed to edit in VR. And someone says it, and it's because I think at that point only 10 people had made a VR video, so it just became canon.
It must be true.
Yeah, but I'd say go with your gut. My favorite is probably a blurred out version, blurred out something, or I think black works pretty well too. It doesn't have to go all the way up and all the way down. Yeah, definitely take out the tripod, like especially if it's little bits of a tripod. Like no one wants to see that. Let's see. Yeah, so thinking about the role of the person, I've read a lot of discourse on this, and I generally tend to just ignore it and say go with your gut. Think about, but if there's, I would say it's not, when I think about it, it's not as important for wondering who am I? Because some viewers might wonder who am I, but it's more where do I stand in relation to these characters? For example, if you're in a classroom and you want the person to identify with the children, you put the person with the children. And people are going to approach this as an audience member, and they might ask themselves, am I a child or am I not a child? I don't think that question is as important as what is my relation to this world. And so think about it if you were going to design a theatrical experience. One thing that's really powerful too is prototyping this stuff in real life. So if you're in a room, just sit where the camera is and see how it feels. And put yourself in the place where it feels the most right. Editing, you can definitely edit in VR. Just edit mindfully, edit carefully, test your edits. Be really careful if you have a video with a very clear center of action, try and keep that clear center of action in the same place. So if somebody's here, it's probably best to move to a shot where that person is in the same place. I'd also recommend fades. Fading down is really nice. Cuts can be a little bit disruptive. Also definitely smooth out audio if you're doing fades, because you've got someone who's really in your story and you don't want to just keep hashing, like smacking at their world. With editing,
Real quick,
yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, another helpful tip is watch your edit with the headset too. Depending on how it's going to be delivered, I think an edit feels very different when you're watching it like a color or just the Adobe drag around preview versus looking in a headset. So it's very important to kind of watch it in the platform that you're eventually going to be delivering it to, because it might feel completely different at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something else I was going to say. Editing. Oh yeah. Also be mindful of, so some viewers will be watching these in full 360 swivel chairs, not connected to their computers, but not everybody will. And they have guides that you can superimpose over your videos that show you a general area of this is where it's really comfortable for the viewer to look, this is a little bit less comfortable. At the very least, I recommend that you keep an eye on that and have some understanding of what it means. Because if your action slowly moves to the right and your viewer is in a place where it's not very comfortable to turn around, they're going to end up all twisted around. So you want to keep, if you can, you want to keep them in that similar area. There's also, if they have a perpetual sense of positionality, like if they're not on a rotating swivel chair, there's a different feeling to looking ahead than looking behind, and so you want to take advantage of that too. Moving, I don't recommend putting the camera on a monopod and moving around in a really jerky fashion. Smoother movements are definitely better. There's thousands of different reports that all disagree on what makes people sick in VR and what doesn't make people sick in VR, but try and move as little as possible. Moving is fine though. So I'll close with a few other scattered tips. Don't get the camera too close to people. About 5 feet away is a good distance. Sometimes I think a lot of VR puts things way too big in people's perception, and part of that is because of these resolution limitations, and that's just a limitation that we're working with, and that should probably be front and center also with the fact that you can't move, is that streaming today is giving you really blurry VR where you're not really able to see much. And so you want to have objects that are as big as possible but not going to overwhelm the viewer. If you have the Samsung Gear, you can record a quick snippet, throw it in your Gear VR, take a look at what that's going to look like, or just iterate, try something, try it again. Eye contact is a really powerful technique. Eye contact feels really real and really powerful in VR, especially I've seen some where someone's walking past you and then they turn and make eye contact, and that's an extremely powerful technique. Acting feels really strange in virtual reality. I've never been able to connect with anyone who looks remotely like they're acting, and acting that looks fine on 2D just doesn't work. And the best example I can think of is I watched a New York Times video. Did any of you see the one in Grand Central Station? It's in Grand Central Station, and there's a mother and a father, and they're saying goodbye to their kid. And the only thing that was the only thing I didn't want to look at, because you look around and you're like, oh, what's that person doing? They're like packing up their bag and running out, and then there's this totally contrived scene happening, and you already know the ending of it. And so that's, I think, a window into the many ways in which narrative just doesn't work, in which this 360 sphere does not lend itself as much to narrative. Then the other one is just test as much as you can. So I'll show you a little bit of these two videos. Does anyone have any questions based on, or we'll do questions. So this is a video I shot a few weeks ago in YouTube Space, and we got asked to put together a proposal, and we wrote it in like a day, and then we cast it and shot it in like 4 days. So it's not the greatest thing that I've ever made, but it was exciting. So because YouTube has a light board, we were able to set a bunch of different light cues, and then we were able to operate it like a theatrical production. So.
Wow, you
Oh, damn.
are rough. Really?
Yeah, the quality's not that good.
I like it.
I like
But-
the set design. And this is with the jump rig?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, the 3D is great. Like watching this in a gear, I can show it to you all in a gear. So we had him, and he was in the dark. And so like one way I did to cue is I have this text going towards him, so it makes you think that you should look at him, and now the lights come up on him. And
Hey, Tom. What's up? Hey.
so I tried to keep it so you wouldn't have to look behind you. If you did, you'd see nothing.
I am sitting here watching.
And it has ambisonic sound, which lets you guide the viewer.
Oh.
So,
Do you have it on an HMD?
yeah, I have it. I can play it on that.
Demo?
Yeah, probably better to do
Is
that.
this like are they in the same space at different times, and is that kind of overlapping, or is it different spaces?
So they're filmed in the same space, but it's meant to be different space, and you'll see it in the HMD. Yeah, it creates a sense of space the same way a theatrical play would, and that they're 10 feet away from each other. But and I think it gives it a presence, because you can feel that you're in the same room with all these actors and they're putting on a performance. And I think it excuses the performative aspects a little bit, because you're next to some humans rather than watching characters on a screen. And this is another video I did called The Cat Aquarium.
Yes.
And have you seen this one? Oh, okay. Yeah, so I call this style low modern. And we just, it's a 2-hour video. At the time it was the longest virtual reality video. And it's just us hanging out with cats. Oh, we can see the cat fight. So this is really good in display in an HMD, because you can watch it for 2 hours. And
This was jump through.
what? Oh wait.
This place. What?
Yeah, it's in Hayes Valley. You can just play with cats.
Wait, what?
And here we did a reflection and some fish.
What did you say you shot it on?
We shot in a jump rig, 14. Yeah, Freedom 360, 14 camera rig. So just GoPros. It's the most boring and fascinating video.
There's a staircase for the cat, dude. Like,
Yeah. So we could watch for a while, but that's kind of the gist.
The internet loves cats.
Yeah, there's a lot of cats. So I'm Michael again. I'm Michael at everythingiseverything.com if you want to get in touch, or I'll be around. Yes.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
wondering if you have much experience keeping a consistent color pipeline all the way through, especially with different rigs.
Oh, it's tough. Well, Lumetri, the new version has this really awesome. So what I would suggest is matching the individual camera feeds before you go through the stitching pipeline. I think that's a huge piece of advice. And Lumetri has a color match feature that's really, really good. And I believe DaVinci Resolve has something that's far superior to that. So process all of, even if you're doing cloud stitching, like processing all of the individual camera feeds before getting at least a base grade on there is very helpful for that.
Right, like I know cameras will take it off a linear and bounce all the exposures between them, but like even then managing that out, and then you're getting these crazy dynamic ranges when you have a camera.
Yeah, GoPro.
Like straight in the sun and one looking at the shade.
Yeah.
That your color grade has to be totally different than you would treat traditional.
Yeah, and those shots are really hard when, especially you have the sun blowing out, and God forbid you've got a GoPro and it's like an 8-bit 420 like MPEG that you get. Like there's best of luck trying to get that back down. So I think live monitoring in that situation is also very helpful. Using less cameras. If you could be, if you're lucky and you're using a bunch of, like, let's say Blackmagic Studios, you could kind of have, you've got RAW, right? So, or at least more color information than you would. Even rigs like the A7S II, despite it being 420 8-bit, you can get some of those super whites down, especially when you have the blown out sun. You can still get some of that information back. So those are a few approaches, but yeah, it's tough, especially when the exposure is varying, or needs to vary so widely in the sphere.
Yeah. Is there much documentation on each individual rig what the actual color response is?
No.
Because
No.
knowing what you're trying to target would help a lot. I haven't been able to find that.
Nobody's doing that, and it's like how
Not
people
yet.
will do a very detailed like lens review and they'll put color charts and everything.
Yeah.
Nobody's doing that for 360, so that's a great idea
Start a
actually.
way to profile like every device so you could do an output like LUT.
Yeah, for each of the rigs, depending on like you should totally do that. I think for GoPro there are a bunch of what is it called, ProRes, or what is their ProTune LUTs out there, but they're like not designed for 360. So maybe that's an interesting YouTuber business idea, man. To be honest.
Did you talk about plugins?
Yes, we did. We covered all the plugin suites.
Cool. Yeah, plugins are so key, you guys, when you're creating your project. If you're not, yeah, I'm always curious, like what mix, because the last time when we had a party, it was 50% was tech and 50% came from film. So it was so interesting to see it hybridized. I mean, obviously, I think if you guys have been reading, that's where we're going and that's where we're headed. And everybody's sort of praying right now for Lytro, and we're still some ways away. But how big is that? Have you guys actually seen the camera? I was at NAB to see the actual camera, and everybody kept describing it as just massive. Like it's so, like right here, it's like this would be the camera.
Maybe like the size of this projector.
No, it's bigger. It's like this. It's like that.
It's big.
And it's really heavy.
It's 16 GoPros. So, and they're vertical and they're basically touching.
Not the jumper, the Lytro one.
Oh, you guys are talking about the Lytro? Oh,
The
that-
Lytro.
Yo,
The Lytro.
you need a truck to move that.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, and so I've heard it's about like that size. Anyway, we went to, that's what is going to be our future for integrating both and hybridizing both. So if you guys haven't Googled it, I'd recommend looking it up. Another thing is, for those of you that do want to learn, Bilawal mentioned workshop. So we do have a workshop this weekend. It's going to be our first one. The next one may be February, March, something like. It's going to be a little bit. So if you are thinking about it, you might want to jump in, because right now we have it low, lower than what competition is who are doing workshops, and actually there's almost nobody doing workshops. Academy of Art is doing that. That's kind of it. One other guy was, but he's traveling. So otherwise, there's LA. There might be a few workshops in LA coming up. And there's very specific workshops. Like eventually we're gonna have specialized workshops, like Nuke. We may have something just on plugins. We may have something covering
Type 3D, more 3D stuff.
Mm-hmm. So just if you haven't joined, some of you might be from Eventbrite, and if you haven't joined the actual meetup, you might want to join the actual meetup just to see when we have things, because it's harder to track if you're only Eventbrite. So I forgot to mention that before, but it's important. So feel free to look at our second event on Film 360 VR, and that is our workshop. And we have some really strong, I come from traditional film, as a director, a producer, I come from professional acting originally at a high school, so I am able to work with actors. So actually when I was hearing Michael talk about the actors, I was sitting there going, well, I haven't had a whole lot of problem, but it's different because I'm in LA casting, really particular about my cast. I know how to work with actors with, I'll throw in some Meisner, I'll throw in some Uta Hagen, I'll throw in some Adler, whatever, where common directors may not have studied. A lot of directors may not have studied years and years of acting. And I have, and I see that it's really like theater. So at least as a beginning, you guys might want to think, I'm going to direct something like theater, and that will help you more work with actors, except they still have to bring it down like film. But that's something I can go into, at the workshop. And I don't know, anything else that you guys want to say?
I think that's it. Yeah, I think, the note that both of us wanted to end on is just experiment, and make stuff. There's no better way to learn this stuff than to go out and make it, even if it's with a Gear 360 or whatever, just go out and start doing it.
Theta.
Even a Theta, yeah.
As bad as the res is, it's...
Yeah. It's great for time lapses. You can make some really nice 4K time lapses out of it. So, and I think the tip that you had for just put your head where the camera is supposed to be, that's probably a very easy and effective way to prototype. And you'd be surprised how many people don't bother doing that. And they'll be like, oh, the camera will be here. Height is one more thing I would add.
Yeah.
A lot of people, especially if you've seen some 360 interviews, they'll put the Gear 360 on the table, and then suddenly you've got these gigantic people all around you, and you're looking at these monsters. Be cognizant that that's somebody's head. As long as you think that way and follow the advice that he also gave,
I think people get in the idea that because you can look any direction, you can just put the camera anywhere.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, we don't have to think about framing, but you still have to think about positioning.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other questions, guys? Or? Cool.